Final Fantasy has maintained a seat at the table of the most revered franchises in gaming. It has longevity as well as critical and commercial success on its side, transforming from an adventurous 8-bit NES fantasy title full of bugs into a series that, for many people, defines the role-playing genre. And naturally, along the way, it's become a treasure trove of interesting trivia. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 Final Fantasy stats you won't believe. Number 10, one SpinOff Series is a serious sales bomb. With Final Fantasy shifting over 185 million units, it falls just outside of the top 10 most successful video game franchises ever. Now, the surprising part isn't Final Fantasy's individual bestseller. You won't exactly be shocked to hear that FF7, with all of its ports, sits atop the pile with 14 million sales as of 2023, with Final Fantasies 15 and 8 claiming the silver and bronze medals respectively. Still, despite being top dog, FF7's 14 million units account for just 7.57% of the franchise's total sales. Obviously, this is down to just how many games there are contributing to that gigantic 185 million. Outside of the 16 main entries, many of which have sequels to them, there are more spin-offs than your brain can possibly retain. Tactics, World of Final Fantasy, Record Keeper, Chocobo Racing, Crystal Chronicles, and so on. In fact, it's Crystal Chronicles that's perhaps the most interesting and one of the more explored sub-series in Final Fantasy. The original game debuted for the GameCube and became the 25th best-selling title on that system, therefore arguably deserving of its eventual remaster for Switch and PS4 in 2020. However, Square likely internally considered this a risk since the game's sequels have brought very little return. In 2007, Crystal Chronicles Rings of Fate for DS scooped up merely 66,000 sales. In early 2009, Echoes of Time was released for both DS and Wii and only managed a combined 57,000 units. Later, a second Crystal Chronicles game was released in the same year for some reason for the Wii, with Crystal Bearers shifting a shocking 39,000 copies. All in all, this brings the Crystal Chronicles series to a total recorded 2.92 million sales, which puts it essentially on par with the sales numbers of Final Fantasy VI for the Super Nintendo. And sure, that's one of the all-time greats, but it's just one game on one system that released in far fewer parts of the world. It didn't even come to Europe. With that in consideration, it's not surprising that the Crystal Chronicles series did lay dormant for over a decade. Number 9, it ties an interesting record of perfect scores. Final Fantasy's quality tends to be pretty high when it comes to the main series, but the debate will forever rage about which game reigns supreme. You should let us know down in the comments which is your personal favourite, because it's fun to see where commercial and critical consensus lies at large. Collated review scores for Final Fantasy IX make it the best received game according to Metacritic, sitting at an impressive 94, with FF10 and FF12 just below, both at 92. Actually, Final Fantasy XII, despite being quite a contentious entry in the series thanks to its major departures in both gameplay and storytelling style, has a very unique claim to fame. It's the first FF game and 6th title overall to receive a perfect 40 out of 40 score from the long-running Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu. As of January 2024, only 30 games hold this honour. Final Fantasy became the second series ever to manage 2 perfect scores in 2011 with Final Fantasy XIII-2. This choice was controversial at the time and remains so, as while critically lauded, the audience reaction to FF13's sequel was far less favourable, and that's putting it lightly. There are only a few franchises that hold multiple perfect Famitsu scores. Metal Gear Solid has 3, and The Legend of Zelda comes out on top with a whopping 5, making up about 15% of the esteemed games on the list. More interestingly, Final Fantasy ties its record of 2 with, of all franchises, its one-time rival Dragon Quest. The two RPG greats who once competed for space in the genre and were eventually united in Square and Enix's merger, both have 2 perfect scores, none of which came before the two companies joined forces. Number 8, the series has multiple world records. Speaking of Dragon Quest, the original installment precedes Final Fantasy by 7 months, which, according to the committee behind the Guinness World Records, makes it the longest running RPG series of all time. It may not be the first, but because its older contemporaries such as Ultima are no longer in production, it allows Dragon Quest to hold the honour. Final Fantasy has a few records of its own. Broadly speaking, whilst it may not be the longest running RPG franchise, it does hold the honour of most prolific thanks to its sheer number of games. In 2017, when the award was recognised, the series had 87 acknowledged titles. Final Fantasy XIV, however, has the distinction of holding 2 world records all for itself. As the original version of the game was due to come to a close and A Realm Reborn was in development, players were offered the chance to join the Legacy campaign. This offered them a bunch of benefits as thanks for sticking with the game through the transition, one of which was the choice to add your name to the credits of the relaunched title. As such, this means Final Fantasy XIV's credits are a hefty ordeal, coming in at 1 hour and 38 minutes long to accommodate all of the players as well as the staff. This got Final Fantasy XIV the Guinness World Record for the longest credits in an MMO game, which is as long as many feature films. The game also bagged the award for most original pieces of music in a game, as at the time the title had a staggering 384 songs on its soundtrack. This will have grown exponentially in the 6 years since, thanks to every subsequent expansion. Number 7, the franchise's iconic theme was a last-minute addition. Speaking of music, this is something where Final Fantasy has largely always excelled. Nobuo Uematsu scored every Final Fantasy game from the first up to 10, with some compositions for titles thereafter. He's one of the most important names in the history of the series, helping to craft its musical identity. Several recurring themes have permeated through the Final Fantasy series. The Chocobo melody, which started in FF2, is reworked into a new genre with every game. The original Final Fantasy gave us our first renditions of the Immortal Victory fanfare jingle, the sweeping majesty of the opening theme, and of course, the simple but effective arpeggio of the prelude theme that opens most of the games in the series. However, despite its importance to the franchise, this came together in incredibly short order. In an email exchange now archived on the composer's website between Uematsu and Final Fantasy writer Nojima during the development of FF10, the topic of the track came up, with Nobuo-san revealing, "I remember during the final stages of development of FF1 there was a sudden last-minute request by Sakaguchi. Hey, I want some music to go in here, it's of utmost urgency," which, upon giving that order, I hurriedly conjured something in 10 minutes. Actually, it's quite embarrassing, as I never expected that tune to span over 10 sequels. 10 minutes of work! To give that context, there's only slightly more than the time left in this video, so think about that when we get to the end of this list and you scroll down to hit the like button. Thanks. Number 6, the hardiest foe in the series has no competition. Whilst it tends to be a more underrated and underloved entry in the series, Final Fantasy V is responsible for introducing an eventual series staple. Optional super bosses are for the hardened adventurer who has mastered the core of the game and pushed themselves further, grinding levels and equipment to a point that nullifies the threat of the game's supposedly all-powerful end boss. And so, through the series, the toughest foe in each game tends to be a completely optional beast that exists purely for the challenge. These, of course, typically have the highest HP. Two of the most prominent examples of this at one point were Ruby and Emerald Weapon in Final Fantasy VII, the latter of which had 1 million hit points, which felt insurmountable at one stage. But with every game for a long time, the numbers associated with enemy hit points grew. It wasn't until FF12 that things went totally off the deep end, with Yasmat, who has a stonking 50 million HP. That's massive by any stretch, but incredibly, the second most HP in the main series seems positively nothing by comparison. Final Fantasy XIII's Long Gui has a pitiful 16 million hit points, 3 times smaller than Yasmat. The vast majority of players who have defeated the demigod, named Yasmat in honour of one-time FF12 director Yasumi Matsuno, do so in battles that range somewhere between 2 and 4 hours long. Some strategies from the experts are said to bring things down to an hour, but most people likely won't have the gumption and dedication to achieve this, leaving them stuck with the long haul. That is, until FF12's 2017 The Zodiac Age re-release, which allowed players to speed up the gameplay, almost like it was designed with this punishingly long battle in mind. Number 5, Final Fantasy XIV's population is incredible. The following stats come from the awesome Final Fantasy XIV census website, which is prime for getting some interestingly nerdy numbers, especially since FF14 has become one of the most respected and popular MMOs in the genre. The February 2024 update for this website lists the population at over 29 million characters. Oh hey, if they all hit Yasmat for 2 damage each, the world of Final Fantasy XIV could defeat that boss instantly. Of course, this isn't the number of concurrent players for the game, because if it was, then Square would need a real-life Mako reactor to power the servers. Instead, it demonstrates the lifetime appeal of the game. From those curious enough to try it out, to those who have created a batch of different characters to play different builds. That said, if every character in the FF14 system was somehow online at once, it would be more people than the population of Australia. The March 2024 census recorded the population of that country as 26 million, which is significantly less than FF14's Eorzea. In terms of regions of the world, America has the most characters with 14 million. How could you not be tempted then to compare that on a more local scale? According to the most up-to-date census readings, that means that Final Fantasy XIV's total number of American-made heroes is more than the population of all but 4 of the United States. Move over, Pennsylvania. Eorzea technically has more recorded residents than you do. Number 4, one player put in a decade of work. Final Fantasy games, as sprawling as they can often be, are not necessarily the easiest games to finish. Just in terms of pure longevity, titles in the series can take a few dozen hours just to get through the story, let alone the optional content. Sticking with Final Fantasy XIV and the census is a very pure example of that. According to the site, less than 5% of characters have been taken to the end game state, in this case claiming the rewards for finishing the Endwalker storyline. Admittedly, Final Fantasy XIV is a game that has grown and grown thanks to expansions, which makes it harder to quote-unquote complete. FF14 at the time of writing has 2,751 achievements, and as of October 2023, the first person to collect them all, a Japanese player on the Garuda server, finally did so 10 years after the game's launch. These range the full gambit of tasks, completing the game's ultimate raids and treasure dungeons, collecting every relic weapon and racking up thousands of PvP victories. It means soloing all 3 of the deep dungeons, collecting 20,000 accursed horde chests and killing an unthinkable number of marks. One of the reasons it would have taken so long is the Lever Quest achievements, which are small combat and essentially fetch quest requests for players to fulfill. Because there are so many to do and they only reset once a day, it's estimated that this alone would take a minimum of 7 years. This player is currently the only person who has ticked off everything from the FF14 to-do list, and can legitimately complain about a lack of content, at least until summer 2024 when the Dawn Trail expansion arrives and undoes his perfect score. Number 3, the most secret side quest took years to find. An achievement list taking 10 years to work through is one thing, but there's an even more shocking number of years when it comes to Final Fantasy facts. In 2013, the FF fandom was rocked by the discovery of a side quest that evaded the community for a full 13 years after the release of Final Fantasy IX in the year 2000. At the beginning of Disc 4, the player can return to Lindblum and visit the Tantalus hideout. There, they'll encounter Zenero and Bonero, who wonder where Marcus and Cinna are and then leave. That all seems fairly normal and not like the setup for a really weird, obtuse series of events. Essentially, if the player enters the game's final dungeon, Memoria, there are a series of moments in their journey to the end boss that trigger the next step of the Tantalus quest. So players can, for example, beat Tiamat, leave Memoria and return to the hideout to see that Zenero and Bonero have also gone missing. If the player does this over and over, eventually it will create a long line of missing Nero family members. And more to the point, a chest will eventually spawn in the hideout containing a protect ring. Amusingly, the fact that a game scored 92 on Metacritic, sold over 5 million copies and is beloved by fans worldwide, had a side quest that went undiscovered for over a decade, is way more interesting than the quest itself. Still, it goes to show that your favourite RPGs are still capable of surprising you no matter how many times you've played them. Number 2, the characters with the most appearances are... Despite most Final Fantasy stories being complete experiences, it doesn't mean that characters are limited to that single entry. Thanks to the series' deep well of spin-offs, the likes of Terra Branford and Squall Lionheart are able to get a few extra appearances in to note down on their resumes. But who is Final Fantasy's mascot? Perhaps Moogle or Chocobo or even Cactar and Tonberry? But these are breeds of creatures. Which single character best flies the flag of Final Fantasy? Cloud Strife currently holds the record for the highest number of playable appearances when it comes to Final Fantasy heroes. This is 21 total FF games over the years, every edition of Theatrhythm and Dissidia, All the Bravest, Record Keeper, a cameo in Tactics, and there's even a mobile game dedicated to his motorbike chase from the original FF7. Adding in a few outside appearances like Urge-Eyes, Smash Brothers, and the Itadaki Street games brings that total up to an incredible 29 performances. When you take playable out of the equation, the answer is easily Gilgamesh. In just the Final Fantasy series, the Wandering Swordsman has 36 appearances over the years. Whilst his design and function occasionally change, he remains pretty consistent present as a multiple weapon wielding powerful force. Alongside it, Gilgamesh's theme, Battle on the Big Bridge, has had 18 in-game arrangements since its first appearance in Final Fantasy V in 1993, making it one of the most revisited pieces of music in the franchise. At number 1, FF7 Remake's Cloud has a lot more edges. Cloud Strife, for people perhaps more so outside of the FF fandom, became the poster boy for edgelords. His giant hair, his big sword, and that wonderfully rendered pout in the likes of Advent Children, despite there being way more to his character than brooding, you can kind of understand why. But his remake incarnation is a lot edgier, in a more literal sense. One wonderful thing about the ironic non-final nature of the Final Fantasy series is how it's grown with the industry. Just comparing 1997's Final Fantasy VII with 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake is a wonderful demonstration of just how far gaming has come. But the thing is, you can of course quantify these leaps in graphical fidelity. To show just how much more power goes into games these days, all one needs to do is look at Cloud Strife himself. Or more specifically, ask Joe Johnston, who has access to the character models, to do it for me. Thanks, Joe. Let's compare specifically the vertices, which are all the sharp corners of the model that create those points and edges. In the 1997 game, Cloud's overworld model has 350 vertices. In the 2020 game, he has 108,000, over 300 times the amount of his squat older sibling. What's more interesting is looking at the polygon budget of the model. The majority of these are spent on our protagonist's face and hair, with far fewer on the actual body. This makes sense since the face is way more important to get right than the costume, as that's where players will largely be looking. And the hair being part of that budget, well, it's Cloud Strife. The hair is everything.